Hey folks, welcome to my channel, or welcome back if you've been here before. Let's discuss the contours of Mercury retrograde at July 2019 into early August. So we're looking at the deeper collective processes happening within this Mercury retrograde period, and we are undertaking a close reading of the aspects. So we're going to be doing that, but let's talk first about the meaning of Mercury retrograde. So we know that Mercury represents our collective perceiving, thinking, and communicative function or faculty. Now, in terms of the logic of Mercury retrograde, Mercury stationing and its retrograde period, these represent a slowing down of our perceiving function, and it represents, let's say, a hyper concentration, a focusing and deepening of our collective thought and mental energy and the capacity for deeper perceptual insight. So inherent in Mercury retrograde is this orientation toward reflection and review and deepening of awareness as Mercury slows down and changes direction. So Mercury's retrograde periods are quite important, and we could liken them to what takes place during sleep. So during sleep, our consciousness needs to review and to reflect and assimilate data, and that's what's happening during sleeping hours. So you could think of something similar happening during Mercury's retrograde periods. The collective mind has to slow down to assimilate and reflect and to process its experience. So we have this sort of micro, macro going on in terms of the individual and what happens on the collective broader level. So during sleep and dream states, the individual processes and reflects and reviews and plays with probabilities. And during Mercury's retrograde periods, the collective mind processes and reflects and reviews and plays with probabilities. So this is partly why we have to sort of adjust the Mercury retrograde narrative, or at least to widen its scope of application. So the reason why communications fail and devices fail and all of that happens is it's more of a consequence of the collective mind and the collective thought matrix being oriented differently and away from the usual sort of forward thinking mode of perceiving awareness or consciousness. So device failure and communications breakdown shows where the collective mind is in a different mode and there is a break on subtle levels from the usual ways of perceiving. So there is a recalibration going on of the collective mind and the opportunity to slow down and to chew on things. And this can't happen when it's business as usual. So Mercury retrograde is nothing to complain about, and it is instead a much needed psychic mechanism within the collective. So we know that because we are subject to a lot of sensory data, the collective mind needs time to slow down. So a part of the agreement of consciousness that we have here on the planet is for the collective mind to get some downtime. So we could say that Mercury retrograde is a very necessary sort of safety valve, in the sense that these Mercury retrograde periods preserve the collective consciousness and they sort of prevent a mental breakdown of sorts. So in other words, just like how when you don't sleep, you can't mentally function, it's the same thing for the collective mind. When the collective mind doesn't slow down and rest and recalibrate and review, we can't mentally function on a collective level. So Mercury retrograde is nothing to be fearful of. It is representative of a process happening within the collective consciousness. And it takes a lot of mental energy to maintain the structures of consciousness on the planet, meaning it takes a lot of highly focused mental energy to be involved in a physical body and to construct physical third-dimensional or 3D reality. So in broad terms, let's just say that it is the collective concentration of mind that props up physical reality as we know it. So it takes a lot of mental focus to maintain the structures that 3D physical reality demands. So ideas of linear time, it takes a lot of mental focus to maintain the structures of linear time on the planet, as an example. So the human being is really very actively mentally engaged, and Mercury retrograde is a release valve that allows us, in a sense, to reconnect to and to be mentally soothed by or nurtured by the broader non-linear reality of which we are a part. Yeah, so during retrograde periods of Mercury, the mind gets some time. The mind gets some more of the energy required to mentally prop up the structures of time and the structures of consciousness that are required for 3D physical reality to function. So it takes a lot of mental energy to, let's say, shut out the greater multidimensional data that we each are individually and collectively aware of on deeper levels. So it takes a lot of concentrated mental energy and hyper focus of perception to shut out the multidimensional data that we know on deeper levels. So in other words, part of being human is to sort of focus, hyper focus, and concentrate our consciousness into this version of reality, and to shut out the greater multidimensional consciousness that we are aware of on deeper levels. So a lot of energy goes into mentally involving ourselves in this idea of linear time. The mind, the collective mind, has to focus to sort of prop up the reality that exists here. So Mercury retrograde periods represent an orientation away from the mental structures required to prop up 3D human reality, physical 3D human reality as we know it. During Mercury's retrograde periods, we are more open on a collective level to an influx of more multidimensional data, which upsets the structures of our 3D systems. And that's why things break down during Mercury retrograde periods in terms of communication and devices. Our collective thought matrix is actually oriented differently during Mercury's retrograde period. So again, Mercury retrograde is nothing to be fearful of and nothing to complain about. So older populations, let's say of antiquity on the planet, accepted the reorientation that Mercury retrograde symbolically represents. Or let's say that these populations were more adept at dealing with Mercury retrograde. They intuitively appreciated the need for the collective mind to slow down. So the sort of modern ritualized culture of complaint around Mercury retrograde sort of masks the deeper logic of Mercury's retrograde periods and prevents us from really getting the mileage out of it. It's an important structure in terms of the collective thought matrix and the human collective mind. Yeah, so on the individual level now, Mercury retrograde calls our attention to what we are individually reviewing and reflecting on, and where we have the capacity to deepen our awareness with respect to specific lessons or areas of life. So I'm going to hop off screen now and continue this as a screencast so you can follow the chart and look at it as we look at the nuances of July's upcoming Mercury retrograde period. So this way you can have a better visual appreciation of the aspects involved. All right, so on July 7, Mercury stations retrograde at 4 degrees Leo. Now, in terms of the critical degrees here, we are looking at the degree range from 23 Cancer to 4 degrees of Leo. That's the important degrees there. Those are the important degrees there during this retrograde period. So let's dive into the aspects here to get a better sense of this specific Mercury retrograde period. The first thing that we notice here is that as Mercury stations retrograde, it is in a conjunction with Mars in Leo. So we see on the chart here that Mercury and Mars are at 4 and 3 degrees respectively, pictured here in the 5th house of the chart. So we're using natural houses as usual, the 5th house being naturally associated with Leo. So we see Mercury and Mars joined up here in a conjunction. So retrograde Mercury and Mars will be dancing together in a conjunction until July 14. But we also notice something else. As Mercury conjuncts Mars, it is also square Uranus. So we have Mercury and Mars at 3 and 4 degrees of Leo, square Uranus at 5 degrees of Taurus. And we have this square in operation until about the 14th of July. So we're beginning to see some of the tones of this Mercury retrograde period take shape. So Mercury is conjunct Mars in a fixed sign, Leo. So on a personal psychological level, we want to be mindful of this idea of aggressively imposing our thoughts on others, and whilst doing that, not being open to other ideas because of our personal sense of pride, and that personal sense of pride being quite Leonian. So Mercury in Leo can sometimes be inflexible or unyielding in terms of absorbing or admitting new information, especially if it's confronted with new data that upsets its sense of personal rightness or personal pride. So we have here a Mercury that is boosted by that Mars, alerting us to our need to be mindful of aggressive assertion of our thoughts in unyielding and headstrong ways. So that's one level. And let's add on now another layer, which is sort of implicit in what we've been suggesting. So this Mercury retrograde period is asking us to admit new data into our perceiving consciousness. So as we said, Mercury retrograde is square Uranus. It's dancing in a square with Uranus until the 15th, from July 7th to about the 15th, while Mercury is retrograde. So within this sort of concentrated slowdown of our mental energy, Uranus is wanting to open up the field of our perception, Uranus to Mercury, especially where we have these rigid ideas and where we've invested a personal sense of rightness into these ideas. So Uranus is knocking on the door of our minds, as symbolized by Mercury, asking us to perceive differently, asking us to admit ideas which may run up against our habitual ways of thinking. So we have the logic of Mercury retrograde, which asks us to review and reflect and recalibrate our perception. And we have Uranus with its own recalibrating logic, insofar as Uranus's impulse is to upset the existing order and to adjust the established pattern. So as the mind slows down, we are more open to these Uranian insights as the mind is reoriented during Mercury's retrograde period. As it goes through a sort of slowdown, we are more open to these Uranian insights and they are able to better penetrate our awareness. But there's one more layer that we have to add on to this Mercury retrograde cake. So we also see that Mercury is trine Chiron in Aries. So we see on the chart that Mercury at 4 degrees of Leo is trine Chiron at 5 degrees of Aries. So embedded into the logic of this Mercury retrograde period is this idea of addressing and dismantling flaws in perception which bring us pain. And perhaps we can get reflective about this. Perhaps we could argue that all pain is as a result of flaws in perception. So we are looking at things the wrong way. Our flawed thoughts result in painful emotion. So with this Mercury Chiron exchange, we have two sides of one coin. The idea of flawed perceptions that cause pain, and the idea that correcting our perception, Mercury, brings about healing, Chiron. So Mercury is dancing, retrograde Mercury is dancing in the trine with Chiron from July 7 to 17. So essentially, we have in this period from July 7 to 17, Mercury interacting in the conjunction with Mars, Mercury square Uranus, and Mercury trine Chiron, the essential aspects here during this Mercury retrograde period. So we can sort of combine the logic here. Uranus's dismantling influence, asking us to disrupt and unsettle ways of perceiving that bring us pain, opening up into new perceiving consciousness, which supports our healing and our integration, as symbolized by Chiron. So let's see what happens next. Let's move the chart along. All right, so on July 19, Mercury changes signs and enters Cancer. So we see here on the chart that on July 19, Mercury is retrograde at 29 degrees of Cancer. It says retrograded back into the sign of Cancer. So Mercury is now in water. It's left fire and entered water. And let's think about this elementally. So with the progression of the zodiac, we have fire signs, followed by earth signs, followed by air signs, followed by water signs. Fire, earth, air, water. That's the natural progression of the zodiac. So fire starts and begins. And water, being last, represents final processes of assimilation on emotional and, let's say, soul levels. So Mercury in fire, we're starting. We are initiating a new perception. And that, of course, that double emphasis there in terms of Mercury square Uranus, initiating a new perception, Mercury in fire. Then, in the reverse progression, Mercury in water gives us the opportunity to anchor and assimilate our new perceptions at deeper levels of assimilation. So we had this Uranian dismantling and introduction of new thought, new perceptions, the initiation of a new way of seeing. As Mercury now moves into water, into Cancer, we personally integrate and assimilate all of this, our new perceptions, into deeper soul and emotional levels of our being. So we see that by the time Mercury enters Cancer, it is moving in retrograde motion toward a conjunction with the Cancer Sun. So let's now pull the chart up for June 21 or July 21, when Mercury is exactly conjunct the Sun in Cancer. So let's do that. All right, so we see both the Sun and Mercury at 28 degrees of Cancer at the exact conjunction here. And speaking of 28 degrees, as an aside, we know that Mercury cannot be more than 28 degrees away from the Sun, subtly reinforcing the truth that it is the overall quality of consciousness, as symbolized by the Sun, that conditions the perceiving mind, Mercury. So how you think, Mercury, is closely aligned with what you are, Sun. So the perceiving mind, Mercury, can't really go beyond the bounds of the essential core of who you are, as symbolized by the Sun. So there's that. But yes, Mercury comes back to the Sun, which symbolically represents a process of integrating our new insights and new perceptions into who we are. And they say that if you really know something, if you really understand something, it becomes part of who you are. So there's less of a separation between you and it. So if you really understand patience, for example, you become patient. So on deeper levels, still within the Cancerian structure of emotional assimilation, we are carrying back the fresh insights of Mercury Uranus and letting this percolate into who we are. So as Mercury conjuncts the Sun, there is illumination of mind and the rebirth of our perspective as Mercury is retrograde. And we see by this time that Mercury is approaching its conjunction with Venus. So let's put on our symbolic lenses and step back and look at the simple logic of this. And while we do that, let's pull the chart up for the exact conjunction of Mercury and Venus. All right, so we're at July 24 now. So our reformed perspective, Mercury retrograde, has to now inform our interactions with others, Venus. So we are relating to others, Venus, on the basis of our renewed and reformed perspectives, Mercury retrograde. So Mercury dances with Venus in Cancer from July 23 until July 28, with the exact conjunction happening here on July 24. So Mercury joins Venus there as part of what happens during this retrograde period. All right, so let's move on. Now, by July 30, Mercury is moving into the opposition with Pluto. So we see here on the chart that Mercury at 24 degrees of Cancer is opposing Pluto at 21 degrees of Capricorn. So let's go forward again. Now on August 2, Mercury now stations direct. So we're not seeing the symbol beside Mercury here that indicates to us that it's retrograde. So Mercury is now stationing direct on August 2. And as it stations direct, it is opposite Pluto. Again, Mercury, 24 degrees of Cancer, opposing Pluto at 21 degrees of Capricorn. So this is a sort of zenith or peak of the process, this Mercury-Pluto opposition. So a Plutonian transformation of our thoughts and ways of thinking, a rebirth. And more than that, the zenith or culmination point of this retrograde period here invites us to refine our perception by paying attention to what is beneath the surface, Mercury-Pluto. So Uranus opens us up into discovery and new consciousness, and Pluto takes that process deeper, inviting a deeper kind of transformation of our perceptual lens. That's Mercury, as Mercury is in the opposition with Pluto as it stations. All right, so let's go on. Now, on August 11, Mercury goes back into Leo. So we see on the chart here that Mercury is at 0 degrees of the sign, entering the 5th house of the chart. So it sets up to square Uranus and to trine Chiron once more. And let's move the chart forward to the exact Mercury-Uranus square. And that's happening on August 16. So let's move forward to that. So at this time, on August 16, as Mercury revisits the road it traveled, it squares up with Uranus. But this time we see that Uranus itself is retrograde. And as Mercury aspects Uranus and Chiron once more, this process represents a final tying up and completion of the process initiated when Mercury stationed retrograde. So we just wanted to take a closer look at what is happening during this upcoming Mercury retrograde period to get a sense of the contours of the energy here and to have a sense of the broader process that we are all a part of collectively. So Mercury squaring up with Uranus, Mercury trine Chiron, Mercury conjunct Mars, Mercury joining up with the Sun, as we said in Cancer, Mercury also joining up with Venus. Those are the essential aspects there, the important ones, as we examine what's going on with this Mercury retrograde period, and of course, Mercury opposing Pluto. That's the journey of Mercury retrograde in July to the beginning of August 2019. So reminding you as usual that I'm available for private astrological counseling consultations. A lot happening this summer as we have the eclipses to contend with, Neptune retrograde, all of that as we are in very demanding times. So links to my private consultations can be found in the description box below. And if you'd like these videos to be sent to your inbox, these sorts of videos, you can sign up to join my email list and to get my gift to you. So until next time, wishing you all the clarity that Mercury retrograde has to offer you and the deepening of insight. So until next time, talk soon. Bye.